Seen from afar, a medieval castle rose like a massive fortress, towering over the hill with its thick stone walls, sharp watchtowers, and heavy iron gates that almost never opened. The darkened walls bore the marks of rain, wind, and warfare, reflecting a long history of sieges and fierce defenses. Though majestic from the outside, the castle's interior blended luxury with hardship, a mixture shaped by the many social classes living within its boundaries. A castle served not only as the residence of the lord, but also as the political, military, and administrative center where every decision of the domain was made. Anyone entering the castle was easily overwhelmed by narrow corridors, spiral staircases, and winding towers built with defensive strategy in mind. The air inside always carried hints of wood smoke, animal hides, and beeswax, creating an atmosphere that felt warm in some rooms and heavy in others. Servants hurried through the hallways with buckets of water, firewood, and trays of food, keeping the rhythm of life steady within the seat of power. Metallic clashing rang out from the training yard, where soldiers practiced daily in preparation for threats from enemy forces. From the watchtowers, guards scanned the horizon, their eyes tracking even the smallest movements across the surrounding fields and forests. Inside the Great Hall, a large fire burned day and night, illuminating banners and tapestries depicting the victories of ancestors. Meetings between the lord and advisors took place around a long wooden table where debates over taxes, warfare, and land distribution shaped the fate of the region. Not everyone in the castle lived comfortably. Servants and soldiers often slept in dark rooms with nothing but straw and coarse wool blankets. Cold winds seeped through cracks in the stone, making unused chambers gloomy, and sometimes giving the eerie impression of footsteps echoing in the dark. The kitchen was the liveliest place, with huge pots boiling over fires and servants rushing everywhere to prepare meals for hundreds of people. Craftsmen also lived within the castle walls: blacksmiths, weavers, leather workers, all essential to maintaining daily operations in the fortified stronghold. Yet behind its grandeur, the castle always held hidden dangers: fires, spies, or disease outbreaks that could sweep through the crowded halls. Children raised inside the castle grew up surrounded by clashing steel, hunting dogs, and lessons in etiquette, shaping a childhood utterly unlike that of rural peasants. In the late afternoon, bells rang to signal the changing of the guard, shifting the castle's rhythm into one of renewed vigilance. Certain areas of the castle were kept locked, accessible only to the lord and trusted guards, fueling whispered rumors among the servants. All these elements came together to create a lively yet tense atmosphere, revealing the true nature of life within a medieval castle. Life here was not only about power and prestige, but a constant mix of heavy responsibility and ever-present danger. The survival of the castle depended on every individual from lord to servant, each contributing to the fragile structure of this world. As one observes the castle's shared rhythm, thoughts naturally turn to the most powerful class within its walls, the lord's family and their way of life. And from there, the story enters the world of feasts, rituals, education, and duties that the nobility carried every day. The lord's family formed the center of power within the castle, where every decision concerning war, taxation, and the order of the domain was issued from a grand and imposing chamber. The lord typically descended from an ancient lineage, bearing the traditions of his ancestors and the expectations of all who lived under the banner of his house. Each morning, attendants woke him to prepare for council, where knights, advisors, and stewards presented matters of importance. His attire consisted of a long tunic, a leather belt, and a cloak adorned with the family crest, a symbol of authority no one in the castle dared to disregard. The lady of the castle oversaw domestic affairs, supervising the kitchens, weaving rooms, granaries, and the rituals required for receiving important guests. She also oversaw the education of the children, teaching etiquette, conduct, and scripture so they would understand the responsibilities of their ruling class. The Lord's sons were usually sent to seasoned knights to learn weaponry, horsemanship, and discipline in preparation for a future as warriors. The daughters learned embroidery, household management, and the art of hosting, for one day they might become ladies of other domains. The children grew up under strict expectations, rarely allowed to play freely, for every action they took reflected the dignity of their lineage. In the great hall, the family dined at a long table with stews, coarse bread, and vegetables, while servants ate elsewhere. Grand feasts were held when honored guests arrived, filling the hall with mead string music and songs celebrating ancestral victories. Despite the luxury, the family lived under constant responsibility, for they had to ensure the villagers' safety and maintain the family's honor. They received envoys, settled land disputes, punished thieves, or mobilized troops when news arrived of enemies approaching the borders. Whispers of rebellion skittered through the corridors, keeping the Lord vigilant. Life within the castle walls was seldom peaceful. The lady often organized small ceremonies for protection, burning herbal incense and chanting prayers to shield the household from misfortune. The furnishings in their private chambers, woven tapestries, carved chests, and a few rare artifacts, still lacked the comforts of modern life. Strong winds whistling past the tower made sleep difficult, as the distant sounds of forests stirred memories of beasts and war. The Lord regularly inspected the weapons hanging on the walls, reminding himself to be ever ready to defend the castle and his family's honor. Guards in a medieval castle were the first to face danger whenever enemies appeared, yet their daily lives were filled with hardship, even in times of peace. They took turns standing watch atop high towers where strong winds cut through their cloaks and bone-deep cold lingered throughout winter. The stone walls were often damp at dawn, making every step slippery and forcing them to stay alert, even as they had just risen from the previous shift. Many guards carried torches or oil lamps during night patrols, but the weak light only made the darkness around the castle feel more menacing. They had to listen for every sound from the forest, the gate, and distant fields to catch signs of strangers or wild animals drawing near. On foggy nights, they could barely see at all, relying only on experience to distinguish the wind from suspicious footsteps. Their armor weighed heavily on them, turning the task of climbing spiral staircases inside watchtowers into a daily challenge. One small mistake could allow enemies to slip through the gate or climb siege ladders, putting the entire castle at risk of falling. Despite such pressure, guards lived modestly tiny rooms, straw beds and meals consisting mostly of hard bread and thin soup. They trained each morning in the courtyard, learning to wield spears, bows, and shields so they could fight instantly if enemies appeared. When unfamiliar travelers arrived, guards had to carefully inspect papers and goods to prevent spies from entering the castle. In winter, they huddled beside small fires along the wall, though strong winds often extinguished the flames, leaving them shivering in the cold. Some young guards claimed that the battlements echoed strange sounds at night, as if whispering memories of old battles. When war broke out, guards were the first to pour boiling oil, hurl stones, or push back ladders to defend the gate. Each battle left scars upon them, burns, cuts, and painful memories of screams and smoke drifting across the ramparts. They were rarely allowed to leave the castle, making their lives monotonous, yet always tense under the weight of constant responsibility. Sometimes they escorted the Lord during inspections, carrying long spears and staying alert to every hidden threat along the way. From the watchtower, they scanned the four directions like the castle's very eyes, ensuring nothing escaped their vigilance. Villagers respected them, knowing the guards' duties were not easy, for their work was steeped in danger and silent sacrifice. When a shift ended, they returned to their small quarters, sat beside an oil lamp, adjusted their armor straps, and slept briefly before the next watch began. The rhythm of a guard's life reminded everyone in the castle that their safety came from those who stood against the wind in silence. No one could live peacefully within the walls without the ever-watchful eyes of the guards, and observing their disciplined lives naturally drew attention to another vital part of the castle, the kitchen, the beating heart of its daily activity. From there, the story leads into the world of cooks and kitchen servants, where fire knives and constant haste created a lively rhythm of their own. The kitchen of a medieval castle was always the noisiest place, where fires burned day and night and servants rushed about like a never-ending current. It was a wide but dim space lit only by a few large hearths and torches fixed to smoke-stained stone walls. Smoke from damp firewood or half-burned charcoal drifted through the air, making kitchen workers cough constantly and their eyes sting red all day long. Huge bronze cauldrons hung from iron frames, flames roaring beneath them to cook stews for the hundreds of people living inside the castle. Kitchen servants chopped pounded ground, washed, and carried water endlessly, turning their work into a chain of heavy labor that stretched late into the night. The kitchen was always hot and humid, and its oil-slick floors forced everyone to step carefully to avoid slipping into boiling pots. The head cook had to oversee every dish meant for the Lord, for even the smallest mistake could provoke anger or suspicion of poison. Food was strictly rationed, as precious ingredients like venison, large fish, or mead were reserved for feasts and honored guests. Kitchen workers woke before dawn to prepare barley bread, boil bones, and cook porridge for the guards, changing shifts, and for servants beginning their day. During festivals, their workload doubled. Some never left the kitchen until the all-night banquet ended, and every pot and pan was scrubbed clean. The smell of onions, fat, and smoke clung to their hair and clothes, making kitchen hands appear far more ragged than the splendor seen in the great hall above. No one in the castle underestimated them, for if the kitchen stopped for even a day, the entire fortress would collapse into disorder. Young servant children ran back and forth carrying firewood or baskets of vegetables, their lively footsteps blending with the rhythmic clatter of knives and chopping boards. In cold weather, they worked close to the flames for warmth. In summer, the kitchen became suffocating, causing the weaker workers to faint. Old cooks often said they learned to listen to a boiling pot, to know when to add salt or herbs, a skill gained only through years of practice. Large cuts of pork or beef had to be roasted on long iron spits, turned by hand for hours until the workers' arms felt ready to fall off. Breads baked in scorching stone ovens required careful handling, for a single careless move could leave blistered burns that took weeks to heal. Despite the hardship, the kitchen was also a place of shared spirits, where servants swapped stories of their home villages, sighed and laughed softly between the crackling of the fire. These small moments helped them forget exhaustion and bound them together like a small family within the vast castle walls. Only when meals were carried up to the great hall did the kitchen truly grow quiet, giving the workers a moment of breath before the next task began. The rhythm of the kitchen reminded everyone that behind the grandeur of the great hall lay an ocean of sweat shed by unseen hands. Thanks to them, every force within the castle, from the lord to the guards, could maintain the strength and order needed to survive. And from the kitchen's heat, the story naturally leads to the forge, where the fire burned hotter. Still, metal clanged louder, and danger lurked in every spark. It was there that the blacksmith upheld the weapons, armor, and essential tools that sustained the entire medieval stronghold. The forge of a medieval castle was the place where the fiercest flames burned, where nails, spearheads, sword blades, and the massive hinges of the castle gate were shaped through human strength and blazing coal. The smithy was always sweltering, filled with smoke and flying sparks, forcing the blacksmith to wear thick leather aprons to avoid severe burns. They struck glowing iron with heavy hammers, each blow echoing across the courtyard like the steel heartbeat of the entire castle. Every tool they crafted had to be durable, precise, and battle-ready, for weak weapons could cost soldiers their lives. Throughout the day, blacksmiths repaired, armor-sharpened swords, forged fresh arrowheads, and created new hinges for the castle's enormous wooden gates. The forge was often built near the training yard, allowing knights to inspect their weapons and request adjustments the moment flaws appeared. The intense heat made blacksmiths sweat constantly. Their hands grew calloused and sometimes cracked from hours of working with hot metal and heavy tools. Summer made the smithy nearly unbearable, forcing workers to pause for a few breaths to avoid collapsing in front of the fire. Even small mistakes, striking at the wrong angle or quenching too late, could render a blade brittle, turning it deadly in battle for the wrong reason. Old master smiths passed down their craft as they worked, teaching apprentices to listen to the metal, to judge its heat and hardness. Even tiny nails and hooks throughout the castle came from the forge, binding the blacksmith's labor to every corner of daily life. They had to keep the coals glowing and pump the bellows constantly, their arms aching yet never permitted to rest. Accidents happened, often slipping, hammers, shards of metal flying, sparks striking eyes, or worn boots letting hot iron scorch a foot. Even in rain and cold wind, the forge burned bright, for the castle always needed repairs to stay ready for war. During wartime, blacksmiths worked through the night to supply enough spears, armor plates, and shield frames for the defenders. No one in the castle denied that if the forge stopped, the defenses would weaken and enemies could break the gates with ease. Though the work was dangerous, many blacksmiths took pride in providing the strength of the castle, from its battlefield needs to its everyday functions. At dusk, they rested beside the cooling forge, watching the last sparks fade like the final beats of a long, exhausting day. They knew that by morning, the forge would glow again, and the hammer would strike once more, for the castle's hunger for iron never ceased. Many said the blacksmith was the castle's silent soul, sustaining its strength through every age of turmoil. Their labor embodied a resilience and skill essential for the fortress to survive storms of war and brutal winters alike. Thanks to these quiet craftsmen, soldiers and villagers alike could feel safer amid the constant dangers surrounding the domain. And from the heat of the forge, the story naturally shifts to the coldest place in the castle, the storerooms and cellars where food and drink were preserved for all who lived behind the walls. There begins a world of storage, preservation, and subtle struggles against time and weather realities few within the castle ever truly noticed. The storerooms and cellars of a medieval castle were not merely places for keeping provisions. They were the hidden heart of survival, especially during the long, punishing winters. Stone steps descended into the cold, damp earth, where dim torchlight flickered across moss-covered walls and the endless scent of moisture. The ceilings were low, forcing servants to bow their heads as they carried barrels of wine, sacks of grain, or tubs of salt down each day. Food was stored in carefully separated sections. Salted meats hung from iron hooks, dry bread lined wooden shelves, and vegetables were kept in large woven baskets. Heavy wine barrels rested along the cellar walls, holding the flavor of feast days and serving as a purer source of drink when snow blanketed the world. The space was always cold, making servants wear extra wool layers to avoid sickness as they worked in the darkness and rising chill of the stone floor. In winter, the storeroom became vital, for when frozen roads cut off all travel, the castle relied entirely on its reserves. The steward had to maintain precise inventories, for even a single miscalculation could empty the storerooms before spring's return. Rats were a constant threat, forcing servants to set traps and seal cracks to prevent devastating losses. Sometimes they heard strange sounds echoing from the shadows and carried wooden sticks in case larger creatures lurked in the corners. The wine cellar was another world, entirely filled with the scent of oak, dried grapes, and faint fermentations that seemed to echo from deep beneath the earth. The cellarer had to rotate the barrels, check their wooden stoppers, and ensure no air seeped in to ruin the precious vintages intended for grand ceremonies. When noble guests visited, the steward called for the finest casks, and servants handled them with utmost care to avoid spills or damage. Large shelves held spices, honey, and precious salts, turning the cellar into a small treasure vault, though few were ever permitted to enter. On the ceiling, years of smoke and moisture had formed a thin black film, giving the place a somber, familiar gloom. Servants often said that each time they entered at night, it felt as if a cold breath from the past drifted up through the old stones. In times of crisis, clean water was also stored here, in great clay jars, in case the well became contaminated or enemies besieged the castle. Every autumn, the storerooms were thoroughly inspected and reorganized to prepare the entire castle for the long winter ahead. None denied that if the storerooms ever ran empty, life in the castle would quickly become harsh and chaotic. Thus, the keeper of the cellars was respected, for they held the key to the quiet survival of everyone within the stone walls. The cellars showed that a castle's strength did not lie solely in high walls, but in the ability to sustain life through the hardest of seasons. From those deep chambers, one learned that true vitality came not only from battlefields, but from careful preparation beneath the earth. And when emerging from the dark cellar into the sunlit courtyard, the story naturally turns to the castle's weavers, those whose hands created the fabrics and emblems of the noble house. They were the ones who preserved warmth and dignity within the castle through all seasons of wind, cold, and war. The weaving workshop of a medieval castle was not the loudest place yet. It was essential for every cloak, woolen shawl, and decorative tapestry was born here. Most weavers were women sitting at large wooden looms, spinning wool or flax into strong cloth that served daily life in the castle. The steady clacking of the looms echoed each morning, blending with the footsteps of servants to create a gentle but indispensable rhythm. They carded wool, cleaned each strand, and spun the fibers evenly to prevent thick or thin patches from forming in the fabric. Dyeing required great skill, using herbs or ground minerals to obtain shades of red, yellow, or pale green for fine cloth. The steaming dye pots filled the room with heat, and the weavers had to stand close to the fire, stirring constantly so the colors would not burn. Fabrics made for the Lord were crafted with exceptional care, decorated with hunting beasts, heraldry, or ancestral emblems that embodied the family's honor. Large looms demanded strength and patience, for every horizontal and vertical thread had to be flawless. If mistakes occurred, the entire section had to be undone. Many weavers suffered back and shoulder pain from long hours at the loom, especially in winter, when the cold stiffened their hands. They also wove wall tapestries that kept the great hall warm, dampened echoes, and added grandeur to the Lord's council chamber. During festivals or when noble guests visited, the weavers worked twice as fast to finish new garments or refurbish old curtains. Every knight's cloak was crafted here, as well, made of thick fabric to resist the wind on the battlements and keep soldiers warm on campaign. Younger weavers learned their skills from mothers or grandmothers, passing down a craft essential for their family's livelihood within the castle. The workshop was also a gathering place where servants shared stories and news, giving the room the feeling of a quiet social hearth. Soft laughter sometimes drifted between the looms, helping them forget the fatigue of a long day spent weaving without pause. No one in the castle underestimated the workshop, for without cloth, there would be nothing to ward off cold cover windows or warm sleeping chambers. Some knights returned torn cloaks from battle, leaving the weavers to mend them with stitches so fine they were nearly indistinguishable from the original fabric. Despite the toil, the weavers felt pride when they saw their creations hanging in the great hall or draped over the Lord's shoulders during council. They knew that each strand contributed to the image and survival of the castle, even if their work was rarely praised openly. At day's end, they gathered up the fibers, covered the looms, and wished each other good rest before extinguishing the oil lamps and leaving the small room. The life of the weaver showed that a castle's strength came not only from iron and stone, but also from the quiet fabrics that kept the community warm. Through their hands, the castle became more vibrant and enduring through winter storms, harsh winds, and endless gray days. And from here, the story naturally shifts toward the learning chambers where the castle's children studied etiquette, writing, and knowledge that would shape their future roles. It was the world of noble schooling where children grew up beneath expectations and responsibilities as heavy as those borne by adults. Education within a medieval castle was not merely about literacy. It was a discipline of attitude, responsibility, and the qualities expected of those destined to inherit power. Noble children began learning at a very young age, sitting in small classrooms with cold stone walls and narrow windows that admitted only a sliver of morning light. Their teachers were often monks or invited scholars who carried prayer books, handwritten manuscripts, and a long staff to enforce classroom discipline. Children learned to read, write, perform simple calculations, and memorize lessons on morality, honor, and duty to their family lineage. The Lord's sons studied battle histories, defense strategies, and the art of diplomacy to prepare for future leadership. Daughters were taught embroidery, household management, guest etiquette, and the dignified virtues expected of women of noble birth. The classroom was always silent, except for the turning of pages and the teacher's steady, instructive voice echoing like a disciplined heartbeat. Children had to sit straight and avoid distraction, for even small mistakes might earn them punishment, often copying long passages of scripture late into the night. Books were precious and locked carefully in wooden chests, for each manuscript took months to copy by hand. Study tools included quill pens, wax tablets, and small knives for sharpening, making learning a slow and patient craft. In cold seasons, the classroom was often colder than the courtyard, as stone walls trapped icy drafts and fires rarely warmed the entire room. Teachers told heroic tales to inspire students, teaching them that honor came not from power, but from worthy deeds. Beyond academics, children trained their bodies running riding horses and practicing archery to prepare for roles as knights or noblewomen. Young squires sparred with wooden swords in the courtyard, carrying small shields and learning to keep balance under strong blows. Minor injuries were considered normal, even necessary steps on the path toward maturity and strength. Teachers also observed their behavior at meals, training them in posture, speech, and proper greetings for receiving important guests. Older students learned how to read maps, identify terrain, and analyze military routes, skills essential for those who would one day rule lands and armies. At night, lessons continued through moral stories that taught them to discern right from wrong, knowledge vital for any future leader. Children often felt exhausted, yet they had to maintain decorum, burdened by the expectation that they would someday represent their entire lineage. Noble education offered little joy or play. It was a system forged to shape individuals capable of surviving and guiding a world defined by power and war. Those raised under such discipline grew to understand that life in the castle was not a privilege but a continuous preparation. From this environment emerged new generations of leaders carrying the thread of tradition through eras of conflict and upheaval. And, as one leaves the classroom behind, the story naturally turns to the world of the knights, warriors of honor whose image remains inseparable from the medieval castle. It was a realm where glory and danger intertwined, forming one of the most defining classes of the Middle Ages. Knights in a medieval castle were not merely warriors, they were symbols of honor, carrying the pride of their lineage and the responsibility of defending the land they served. From early adolescence, they were sent to work as pages tending war horses and serving elder knights to instill the discipline required of their future station. Their initial duties were demanding carrying shields, polishing armor, keeping weapons sharp, and obeying every command to build endurance and resilience. When they were older, they became squires trained in horseback riding, swordsmanship, archery, and the use of the lance during long drills in the outer yard. Every fall from a horse or misjudged angle of a strike could cause injury, but such risks were considered essential steps on the path to knighthood. They studied battlefield tactics, formation maneuvers, and how to protect the standard bearer of their lord during combat. A knight's armor was heavy and stifling, making long hours of wearing it a test of physical strength that only the hardy could endure. Swords and lances were forged specifically for them, tailored to their fighting style, leading knights to treat their weapons as extensions of their very souls. Knights also learned etiquette, for they represented their lord's honor and were expected to address guests, greet nobles, and conduct themselves with proper nobility. In times of peace, they patrolled the domain, protected merchants, suppressed banditry, and maintained order so villagers could work in safety. They trained relentlessly, knowing war could erupt at any moment and that the castle would be the first target of any invading force. During festivals, knights competed in jousts, demonstrating their skill and upholding the dignity of their family before the entire domain. These contests were as dangerous as real battles. Horses could slip or lances could break and cause serious injury. Knights lived in small yet solemn chambers, decorated with banners, shields, and weapons that symbolized a life bound to the battlefield. Many bore scars on their arms and faces, remnants of combat or training accidents, marks that testified to their unwavering loyalty. When the castle was besieged, knights formed the core of its defense, leading counterattacks or holding the gate against siege ladders and flaming arrows. In moments of danger, they had to remain unshaken, for if a knight fell, the morale of soldiers and civilians could collapse instantly. Many knights died young, their names etched into stone slabs in the inner courtyard as eternal reminders of sacrifice. Those who survived understood that honor was not glory, but a burden they willingly carried to protect their domain. And despite the dangers embedded in their lives, they took pride in serving their house, donning armor and standing among the ranks of noble warriors. The life of a knight showed that a castle's strength rested not only in stone walls, but in the loyalty of those who wore iron. Thanks to them, every class within the fortress could live safely amidst an age of conflict and relentless threat. And as we leave the knight's world of glory and peril, the story naturally descends to the lowest depths of the castle, the dungeon. There, darkness, iron chains, and muffled cries reveal an entirely different and far harsher face of life within a medieval stronghold. The dungeon of a medieval castle was the most terrifying place of all, buried deep beneath the earth, with thick stone walls, cold, damp air, and a moldy stench that clung like a shroud. The descent was a narrow stairway, each footstep echoing with a hollow tone that made one feel as though they were walking into a world without light. The jailer carried heavy keys and stayed constantly alert, for prisoners could rebel or attempt escape at any moment. The cells were small and pitch dark, lit only by a narrow slit in the wall that allowed a faint glimmer of light, leaving inmates unable to tell day from night. Prisoners were often thieves, spies, rebels, or those in severe debt captured when they had nowhere else to flee. Iron shackles bound their hands and feet, scraping flesh until raw and infected, especially in winter when the metal froze against their skin. The jailer had to inspect the cells regularly to prevent inmates from using the darkness to break locks or dig through weaker patches of stone. Groans echoed through the halls, making the dungeon a haunting place for anyone sent down to work their shift. Food for the prisoners was simple hard bread and well water, just enough to keep them alive until judgment or ransom. Important captives were kept in separate chambers under tight guard to prevent rescue attempts or assassination. Jailers worked in harsh conditions, stale air, the stench of waste, constant coughing, and the risk of catching diseases from inmates. Old wardens claimed they sometimes heard strange whispers from the darkest cells, as if curses lingered from those who died within. Water seeped through the stone walls, making the floor slippery and increasing the risk of guards falling or prisoners taking advantage of their misstep. On some nights, they stood for hours beside the heavy doors, listening to the wind howl through long corridors, as though ancient spirits still roamed there. Some prisoners pleaded, wept, or shouted in fury, forcing the jailer to maintain a firm mind to avoid being swayed or intimidated. During wartime, the dungeon held spies or captives seized outside the castle gates, making the atmosphere even more tense. Jailers often checked cells with torches, meeting the desperate or hateful eyes watching them from the shadows. Guarding prisoners was not just a duty, but a mental trial steeped in darkness and fear at every turn. Harsh as it was, the dungeon was an essential part of the castle, maintaining order and protecting the domain from chaos. The jailer lived a quiet life, but played a vital role in upholding the discipline and authority of the stronghold through turbulent years. The dungeon revealed that darkness in the castle did not lie only beyond its stone walls, but also within the chambers where doomed fates were kept. Thanks to those who stood watch in the shadows, the castle preserved its laws and the ruling family's power. And leaving that cold and somber place, the story rises into a contrasting world, the great hall where firelight blazed and feasts displayed the castle's grandeur. It was there that the nobility's most splendid and lively moments unfolded through music, wine, and ceremonies that lasted long into the night. The great hall of a medieval castle was its brightest heart, where blazing firelight illuminated banners, woven tapestries, and gleaming suits of armor, symbols of the family's enduring power. The vast space with its high ceiling and long wooden tables gave anyone who entered a sense of grandeur mixed with the cold stillness of ancient stone. Feasts in the great hall were held on holy days after victories, or when envoys arrived from distant lands, each event carried out with solemn ceremony. Torches were brought to every corner by attendants, filling the hall with warm light that shimmered against the red reflections on the knight's polished armor. Tables were laid with abundance, roasted meats, barley loaves, grilled fish, forest greens, and honeyed wine that filled the room with life. Strings, wooden flutes, and small drums blended into lively music, turning the hall into a place of celebration. Unlike the gloom outside the walls, the Lord sat at the head table in a high-backed chair, clad in fur-lined garments, watching the hall with eyes embodying both authority and responsibility. Beside him, the lady of the castle maintained etiquette, greeted guests, and ensured the gathering remained orderly and dignified. Knights shared tales of battle, displaying scars and recounting narrow escapes from enemy blades. Servants hurried constantly, carrying wine, clearing dishes, and tending the fires, for the hall had to blaze with light until the very end of the feast. Noble children sat near their parents, observing every ritual and learning how to bow, speak, and uphold the dignity of their lineage. In another corner, storytellers performed tales of ancestral victories, adding depth and tradition to the night's atmosphere. Despite its splendor, the Great Hall could also be a place of tension, as wine loosened tongues and disputes threatened to flare, requiring the Lord to keep order. When guests from other domains attended, the feast became even more elaborate, for every detail served as a statement of power and prestige. Tapestries embroidered with the family's sigils hung above, reminding all present of the castle's long history of battles and triumphs. A priest sometimes offered blessings before the meal, giving thanks for harvest, victories, or fleeting peace among neighboring lands. Dancers moved lightly to the rhythm of the music, their flowing garments adding joy and color throughout the vast room. But behind the scenes, servants remained tense, knowing even a minor mistake could anger the Lord and bring harsh punishment. As night deepened, the festivities gradually softened, the music faded, guests retreated to their chambers, and the hall dwindled to the faint glow of dying embers. Servants cleaned through the night, wiping tables, gathering cups, and sweeping ashes, so that by morning, the hall would regain its solemn dignity. These feasts strengthened the unity of the castle, bolstered its reputation, and displayed the Lord's prosperity before the entire domain. Thus, the Great Hall was both a radiant stage of grandeur and a reflection of the weight of authority borne by its ruler. And as the firelight dimmed across the vast chamber, the story naturally turns to the castle's final rhythm of the day, that quiet hour when hallways darken, guards change shifts, and everyone prepares to enter a night's sleep filled with lingering worries. When the music faded in the Great Hall and the last torches dimmed, the medieval castle slipped into its nighttime rhythm, where silence settled over every long corridor. Cold winds whistled through the cracks of stone walls, their hissing a reminder that outside the fortress, darkness always waited for a chance to creep in. Servants finished cleaning the kitchens, extinguishing the great fire, and leaving only a few glowing embers to warm their sleeping quarters in the damp lower floors. The Lord departed the great hall, followed by guards carrying oil lamps whose faint glow lit the tapestries depicting ancestral triumphs upon the walls. The lady of the castle checked the children's rooms, adjusted their blankets, and whispered a quiet prayer for peace over her family and the entire domain. The young nobles drifted into sleep to the sounds of wind and distant footsteps of patrolling guards, an unusual lullaby belonging only to castle-born childhoods. In the courtyard, guards changed shifts, taking up spears and tightening armor straps before ascending the towers, where the night wind blew so fiercely it stole their breath. Oil lamps flickered along the battlements, casting long, wavering shadows as sentries paced and scanned the darkness beyond the walls. Down in the dungeon, the jailer made his rounds with a torch, the faint clink of chains echoing like a reminder of the castle's deepest shadow. In the kitchen, cooks slept beside a pot, still warm, ready to rise before dawn to light the fire and prepare the morning meal. The blacksmith rested in a small room near the forge, where lingering heat from the coal made the air more bearable and restored strength for the next day's labor. In the weaving workshop, looms lay silent beneath their cloth covers, the faint scent of wool and herbs lingering like traces of a long day's work. Along the eastern hallway, the wind beat against narrow windows, compelling any servant passing by to clutch their cloak tightly against the cold. The knights' chambers glowed faintly, with candlelight illuminating the armor hung neatly on stands, its glimmer like unblinking eyes that never slept. Knights often lay awake thinking of battles that might come or duties awaiting them at sunrise. In the study, maps and letters sat on the Lord's desk, where he sometimes remained late into the night, reviewing matters of the domain despite his exhaustion. Night watch servants cleaned the corridors, checked doors, and swept dust, so the castle would appear orderly and dignified by morning. Occasionally, a small bell rang atop the tower, a sign of a shift change or a warning, sending a ripple of alertness through the fortress. In the darkness, the castle never truly slept. Each post continued its quiet vigil to safeguard everyone within its stone walls. The stillness of night was a cloak that concealed countless worries, responsibilities, and burdens the castle's inhabitants bore throughout their lives. Night in the castle was not merely a time of rest. It was proof of a system that never ceased, a place where power and danger existed side by side. Thanks to the endurance of all who lived within the fortress, the castle continued to stand firm, amid an age of turmoil and war. And as dawn slowly touched the horizon, new light struck the watchtowers, marking the beginning of yet another long day in the ancient stronghold. This rhythm repeated endlessly, forming the steady cycle of medieval life where power, labor, and human fragility intertwined day after day.